Hi, in this one, we're going to be understanding the concept of functions in programming and making our lives easier as a programmer because functions really do that. So let's get into it and see how they do that for programmers. First off, let's understand what is a function. A function is a named group of lines of code that performs a certain task. You can think of a function as a structure that holds a group of lines of code that can be reused under one name. Think of it as 10 lines of code that you've written and you want to reuse those lines of code elsewhere in your program. So instead of writing the same 10 lines of code 10, 5, or 20 times again in your code, what you do is you just give these lines a name and group them up as a function, and then simply just call this function. Let's take a look at how that really works out. So let's say you've got some code for a social networking platform that you're working upon. In this case, what you see on the left side of your screen is a bunch of black lines and a bunch of blue lines. So let's assume for this example that the group of blue lines or the groups of blue lines are the lines of code that you're constantly repeating throughout your master code. Now, these groups of blue lines, what they're doing is they're simply helping you post an image on your social networking platform. So you give them a name, post image. Now, post image is your function, and you can basically tell that by looking at the parentheses or the two opening and closing curved brackets at the end of the name post image. These 10 lines of code that help you post an image that you're repeating throughout your code are grouped under the name post image. And then what you do is you simply call the function post image wherever you want all of these 10 lines of code run in your master code or in your larger code. So this is how functions, number one, help you clean up your code and also, well, manage your code in a much, much better way. Now let's take a look at how we could basically use functions to our advantage as programmers and how functions really help programmers. So they help us reduce the number of lines of code that we write. So that basically happens when you reduce repetition in your code. That is the example that we just saw. We basically took 10 lines of code, grouped them up under the function name post-image, and then simply just called the name post-image or the function name post-image throughout our code, which reduces the number of lines that we write or the number of repetitive lines that we write by a lot. Next, they make the code look cleaner and more structured. Less lines of code doing the same thing definitely make the code much more cleaner, much more manageable, and much more structured. Next, they make the code easier to debug. So this basically means that if you have some issue in your social networking website where you've written this post image function and your images aren't being posted in the right way or they're just not being posted, you know what kind of or what lines of code do you need to look at and fix because the code for posting an image is written within this function, which is the post image function. Now let's take a look at the structure of a function. So first off, you have your function name followed by the parentheses, which are the opening and closing curve brackets, which also tell you that something is a function. And then, well, your colon. So the colon is where your function definition basically begins. After that, under this line, you have the body of the function, which is basically the lines or the group of lines of code that belong to this function. Now, if you observe, the body of the function is actually indented a little to the right. Here you can see that we have an indent of 4 spaces or a tab, and we'll look at this in the next video as we code on functions and as we build some functions of our own. But yes, whenever there are lines of code that are indented with 4 spaces or a tab under your function name, all of those lines of code are grouped under that function name, or as we call it, they belong to that function with the given function name. Finally, let's talk about some rules for setting function names. Functions cannot contain spaces. So function names cannot contain spaces. You cannot have a name that says function space name. It has to be without spaces. They can only contain characters from uppercase A to Z, lowercase a to Z, the numbers 0 to 9, and an underscore. No other special characters like an exclamation mark are allowed. Functions also cannot begin with a digit or special character as we spoke. So basically you can have a function name called post image, post underscore image, post 123 image, or post image 123, but your function name cannot be 123 post image or uh, you know exclamation post image, because that just goes against the rules or syntactical rules of Python. Now let's move on to PyCharm in the next one, actually code out functions and understand functions in a much deeper and practical sense. Until then, have fun and I'll see you in the next one.